Ward, as you know, is a professor of theology and is director of the honors program at St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire, where you're teaching this afternoon, I believe, right?
I am.
Okay, good, yeah.
I drive fast.
Yeah. As William Shakespeare would put it, Ward is a man of parts. He is a respected scholar of the history of theology in the early modern period, from the 15th to 17th century, especially of John Calvin, who's written 3 very smart books. He's written 4 monographs, one that I always use, entitled Rhino Niebuhr in Theory and Practice, which is a great book. So if you're a Niebuhr student, then you might want to run out and buy that, right? Since it's his other books study John Calvin, the towering figure in the Reformed tradition of Protestantism. His new book, could you hold up the fetish object there? His new book, published this year by Cambridge University Press, is entitled Calvin and the Christian Tradition, Scripture, Memory, and the Western Mind. Please join me in welcoming William. So how do you want to structure this? How long are you going to speak and how long?
I was going to aim at 15 to 20 minutes,
okay.
Mark, and then I'd far rather have a conversation about the ideas that I'm putting forward. Yes, absolutely, this is based on the book, but that's 250 some pages, so I won't just read it to you. Even at my fastest Midwestern reading, that would not work. Instead, today I want to talk to you about a tale of 2 cities. Geneva in the 16th and Boston in 2022. Apparently somebody wrote a book with that title earlier than I did. And this is not Paris and London in the years leading up to the French Revolution, but rather 2 different cities that help us perhaps to understand how tradition has come down to the present and some of the problems that have accompanied that. So Calvin's Scripture and Tradition, and one must understand, and it's nice to have someone here from Gordon, one must understand that in certain circles where I work, Calvinist or Calvinist Mafia or the Michigan Mafia, saying Calvin and tradition is already a category fault. But Calvin faced a problem that many theologians over the last couple thousand years have faced. How can we support controverted claims? Philosophers are going to call this the problem of foundations or epistemology. And Calvin is rejecting the Roman claim of a hierarchical tradition, but he also rejects Anabaptist or spiritualist efforts at biblical originalism, sometimes called biblical primitivism. He argues that he will base all of his doctrine and practice on the plain sense of Scripture. And if you're reading that in the Latin, it's the sensus iuranis. And this is the Reformed, as opposed to Lutheran, basis of the argument for sola scriptura. However, and in any book or mystery story, there's always a good one. There's always a however. Calvin had a clear and politically powerful narrative, and generations of Catholics and Protestants both have repeated this narrative. Protestants, it's all Scripture. Catholics, Scripture and tradition. But, and here's the first big point in the book, Calvin's theology is absolutely dependent on tradition. At a number of places in his thought, his doctrine looks far more like Orthodox Catholic tradition than the plain sense of Scripture. At various times, he even admitted in his work that there was a tradition that directed Christian practice, though he explicitly attempted to narrow that far more than Trent would. He writes a treatise called The Canons and Decrees of the Council of Trent with Antidote. And in that, he speaks to the tradition that says, okay, they think it's this, but a true tradition would have to be far narrower. As well, and I think this is truly telling, he spends enormous amounts of effort throughout his treatises, throughout the institutes, in his exegesis, and in his polemics, denying Orthodox figures to his opponents. It doesn't matter who the opponents are. They could be radicals. You're not in connection with the fathers. It could be Catholics. You're not reading Augustine correctly. It could be Lutherans, libertines, everyone. And I think we haven't spent enough time really thinking about that. So my talk here is kind of running counter to a Reformed tradition. Later this year, I'll speak at Calvin Seminary, and I'm not going to wear as nice a suit because I expect them to throw things. There is a Reformed tradition that has grown up that argues that its method and conclusions cannot be argued because they are purely biblical. And an enormously important theologian at the Genevan Academy, Francis Turretin, taught this. But so does James Henley Thornwell, who is a Southern Calvinist preacher who is preaching we have to have slavery. God tells us, the Scripture gives it to us, so and don't talk to me about the golden rule. You're misapplying it. Karl Barth, and I know that, and again, Karl Barth's a way bigger name if I were at Princeton than here, but Karl Barth, this is the basis of his theology. Whenever he would argue, say, with one of the figures I spend more time with, Reinhold Niebuhr, he would say, but the Scripture. I know you're talking about things in the world, but the Scripture. This is a problem. All right, so do I have any evidence for this? Yes. Go buy the book. Make great presents for all the naughty Calvinists on your list. And there are no nice Calvinists because, total depravity. But I organize it in 4 chapters. Calvin's exegesis, Calvin's polemic, Calvin's vernacular works. And that was really important. Calvin writes a lot of French theology. And there was a kind of assumption in Calvin's studies that, well, of course, that will all be purely biblical because they're lay people. They don't know any theology, and so it won't matter to them that there's a tradition. That's not the case when we look actually at it. And finally, his big doctrinal works, and especially I'm talking about the various versions of the Institutes. He wrote the Institutes first in 1536. His last Latin edition is published in 1559. There are 3 intervening versions, and it's just like anything, just like our students. You write a paper, it's 4 pages long. You work on it, now it's 7. Work on it some more, it's 15. if you work on it long enough, you have a doctorate. That's exact. This starts the Institute starts out as a little book of 6 chapters and ends as a book of 80 chapters divided into 4 books. So the 2 examples I'll talk to you about are the argument for Scripture's warrant for infant baptism, and lots of doctrinal historians who are looking at the 16th century say, this is a problem for the Protestants. Because read the New Testament carefully, there's just no one who's clearly a child being baptized. The closest you get is Cornelius and his whole family. But what's his whole family? Is that his adult slaves? Is it, Cornelius is already a centurion. He's probably not young. So there's no clear kind of, let the children come to me and I will baptize them. Had Jesus said that, wow, Protestants would be so much happier. So Calvin makes this argument again and again and again and again. And at one point he says, people who don't understand that Scripture supports infant baptism are like people who can't see that the Trinity is clearly represented in the New Testament. I'm like, well, yeah, there were no fights over that ever. And then he ends the whole section by saying, so let's just go with the regula fide. Well, the regula fide is nothing other than the boiled down tradition. This is what the church teaches, the rule of faith. I was crazy shocked when I found that. Another place, and he has so in 1549, Calvin agrees with the ministers in Zurich on how to understand the Eucharist. This document eventually becomes called the Consensus Tigurinus, the Swiss consensus. And it makes Lutherans lose their lunch. They just all go crazy. And they start writing against Calvin. And so an interesting one. So Calvin starts responding because he's got really thin skin. And he's responding to this Lutheran, Joachim Westphal, and he starts out by saying, now clearly, you're a Lutheran, I'm Reformed. He doesn't say Reformed, but we're both of the evangelicals. So we can do this all on Scripture. And his next 20 pages are about the correct interpretation of Augustine. I was like, you just said it! He's like one of my bad students who says, this paper will be about X, and the next 4 paragraphs are A, B, C, and D. No, you said X. He doesn't, it's because it's that important. So Calvin generates a functional theory of tradition. I want to be clear, it's a functional theory. He doesn't ever write this down, but this is what he's doing. Tradition would be historical. Canons of historical research could not be denied by a prelate. This is a rejection both of the hierarchical model and a rejection of radical originalism. Because he's actually accepting, okay, things have changed since Jesus' time. We understand the gospel message differently across time, so tradition matters. Second, he does believe tradition is going to be orthodox. He put serious boundaries on both biblical and doctrinal investigations. And he probably doesn't realize how much he's doing that. My theory about that is he looks at Catholics and says, okay, I'm not doing exactly what they're doing. I'm less tradition bound than they are. And he looks at something that is a relative difference, and he believes that it is an absolute difference. And that's a philosophical problem. Calvin believed in an orthodox core. And the orthodox core looks a lot like Augustine. Now, to be fair to Calvin, for anyone else writing in the 16th century, the orthodox core of Christianity looks a lot like Augustine. That's true if you're Lutheran, or if you're Catholic, or if you're Anglican. Where it breaks down is in radicals. That tradition is going to be transparent to the community. Terry Tilley has a great book on tradition where he makes this argument, and it's really well taken. And that's what Calvin's trying to do. This will have to be put in front of people, believers. Tradition is in a hermeneutical circle with the Scripture. That's why he constantly says, I'm going to write commentaries, but you've got the institutes, and then, you kind of work them together. You never just go into the Scripture. He says anyone who does it without a guide will just wander here and there. And tradition reception is going to be critical. We're going to have to think about what it means, and have we ever gotten it wrong? Well, so far I've been talking about Geneva. What about Boston? First question. Wow, why has this model existed so long? Number one, Calvin said so. And a lot of people took him seriously. Two, both Protestant and Catholic traditions grew up invested in this. Protestants saying, okay, we're only on this. And Catholics saying, yes, they are that, and they're wrong. Both sides accept this, and I've got a whole chapter in there, and lots of people who will now be mad at me because I put the actual footnotes in. Western modernity is the receiver of all of this. There's a kind of ambivalence or multivalence of the modern Western mind. On the one hand, this kind of Kantian argument that rationality is based on pure rationality, and that an open acceptance of tradition is either misunderstood or understood in such a plethora of ways that we don't really get to anything further. So this is a problem that we have received. We're the inheritors, both from Calvin's claim and a Roman claim that is situated in persons. That the tradition, when a pope said, "I am the tradition," Calvin and what I'm arguing, that's unhelpful. So, just throwing rocks at my own tradition. This has created enormous problems in the Reformed tradition. A Reformed tradition that claims it's not a tradition. One, women. Calvin, great example. Calvin is the head of the Genevan consistory, which is kind of a morals court in Geneva. In it, he represents his brother in his divorce case against his sister-in-law, while still maintaining his position as the head of the consistory. So he's arguing to himself, that's a great argument. I believe me. And never kind of backs off and says, well, that would be a conflict of interest. This comes all the way down to the modern, and I want to be so crystal clear. I will argue this to anyone at any point. This modern theory of complementarianism, that is a new thing. That is made up. That is that is not the church's ancient tradition. Women have a role, men have a role. Modern evangelicals and Calvinists will make this argument. Problems of dealing with the races. Robert Henley Thornwell preaches the opening sermon to the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America, basing it on this kind of argument. But apartheid theology is absolutely based on this, and those are all Calvinists, and proud of it. I can go further. The poor, immigrants, the planet, but that's a whole nother book. So, because I sometimes a historian, sometimes a theologian, I argue to you, here are the rudiments of a Reformed theology of tradition. First, the engagement of Scripture and tradition must be broad. It's got to be an ecumenical in the oikumene sense. So historians, theologians, pastors, bishops, lay people, yes, city planners, NGO leaders, politicians. So many, this has got to be a large sense. The critical tradition of the reception of the Christian tradition has to be explicit, open, historically rational. We're going to have to say, at certain times the church made an error. And if we're not able to say the church made an error, we at least have to say, well, that was a bad path. Sometimes change will neither be gradual nor gentle. Mark Massa has written a really great book called The Structure of Theological Revolutions.
I paid him to say that.
Buy that book too.
Oh gosh, you totally should.
We all have it.
And here he's working on Kuhn, but that our sense, well, the church works slowly. No, it doesn't. That's and King, Martin Luther King Jr., said, justice delayed is justice denied. Yeah, he's right. Finally, the hermeneutical circle of tradition and scripture must be examined in ways that allow new insights. That was true in the 16th century, where they were recovering original languages. It's true in the 19th and 20th century, when we're installing the historical critical method. It's true now as we're reading voices that have long been kept out. So, I'm almost there. Our present state, and this is the epilogue to the book, I make an argument that this shows up. All of this that I'm talking about shows up, and it shows up in textual originalism. And two really important examples of this are biblical literalism, that argues we're purely textual based on a divinely inspired word, and constitutional originalism. If you were listening yesterday to the arguments, 2.5 hours in, Justice Kagan says, nobody's talked so far about constitutional originalism. And she said that because, the 14th Amendment is going to be pretty strong on saying, well, yeah, you can have affirmative action. And so 6 people who go to their graves screaming, I'm an originalist, well, they're an originalist when it works for them. Just like biblical literalists are literalists when it works for them. There's real possibilities here. Catholics and Reformed could recognize the significance of epistemic communities, especially in the political and cultural sphere. This is one of those places. Father Tavard argued, Catholics and Lutherans have made far more progress in talking to each other than Catholics and Reformed. This is an area we could. This is, and I think that would matter. We're not climbing a scaffold to go back to the Tale of Two Cities. We're not climbing a scaffold together and saying it is a far, far better thing than we have done, that we have written another book or read it. But we may see new possible visions. And I thank you for your time, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
Ward, let me ask the first one. As you know, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Charles Briggs, very famous Presbyterian biblical scholar, who's excommunicated. He was thrown out of the Presbyterian Church for teaching historicism. And I was deeply consoled to learn that with the Presbyterians, there's a group that fights as like cats and dogs, just like the Catholics. So I was deeply consoled by that. My question is, how many bodies of Presbyterian churches exist in the United States? How many different Presbyterian churches?
So just the main ones. The largest is the Presbyterian Church USA, and that's also the most liberal. None of these are anything that I would call large. That one has about 1.7 million people, communicant members in it. Then the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church in America, which have, those two denominations have tangled histories, but they both exist. And they're pretty conservative at the level of, okay, women are not ordained.
Divorce.
Divorce is, of course, they'll put up with divorce because people get divorced. Good people, not bad people who are homosexual. Good people get that, and I'm being nasty. There is a tiny denomination called the Bible Presbyterian Church. There's two more of note. There is the Evangelical Presbyterian Church that was founded by Andy Jumper in, was that 77?
Yeah, relatively recently. Okay.
And
So it exists between the PCA and PCUSA.
right, and there's a different one called the Evangelical Covenant of, and they keep changing the name. So it used to be the Evangelical Covenant.
Let's call them ECO. I don't know what.
Yeah.
ECO. I don't know what it stands for.
I counted 22 at one point in my life, so I can't remember that. But my question to you is, I have a theory which I want you to shoot at. Calvin among the Presbyterians has the same place as St. Thomas Aquinas among the Catholics. So in other words, if you go to Gordon Conwell, Union Theological Seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, you're going to get completely different reads of the place of Calvin, and Calvin's important. In the same way that you go from, say, the Boston College Theology Department to St. John's Seminary. When I was dean, I used to say there was a time difference. Our schools were 400 feet apart, and I used to say there's a time difference when it's noon and the SGM is 1944 at St. John's Seminary. So in other words, my question is, is that right, that the perception of Calvin as sort of the major font for the Reformed tradition is taken differently at different Presbyterian?
Yes. Now, Richard Muller, who is a fantastic scholar with whom I disagree most of the time, but his scholarship is beyond reproach at all times. Muller will argue that the Reformed tradition is far broader than Calvin, and we should not simply call it Calvin. But Calvin is that figurehead that's so revered that, if you say, okay, so I just was at a conference and I said, we're going to do critical receptions of Calvin, and we had 40 people in the room, as opposed to if we'd said critical receptions of 16th century theologians, it would have been 5. Because people care. Whether they should or not, that's a different question.
So this is a slightly long-winded question, but it has to do with Calvin's exegetical method. Because if everything depends on interpreting Scripture, that means how do you read the Scripture? So stepping back a bit from that, Calvin was trained as a humanist, and he was a lawyer. His first scholarly work was a treatise on the Stoic philosopher Seneca, as I recall, and it was Seneca's treatise on mercy, on clemency, which of course feeds directly into the doctrine of predestination. In any case, the way the humanists recover, receive, and read ancient texts implies a historical method, because what the whole humanist movement was about was saying we either haven't read texts that will give us a new framework, or we've been misreading them. And if you know how to read a 4th century text, you recognize the Latin is different, the rhetoric is different, and so we have to reread Augustine in light of what is an implicitly historical recovery method, and a fortiori the Scriptures. That if we're reading the Bible, we read it under the tutelage of Erasmus and Valla and the humanists who taught us to reread Scripture. With that being said, to what extent do you think humanist biblical critical methods influence Calvin's way of reading Scripture in the plain sense? Because if you think about the 4 senses of Scripture in the Middle Ages, I don't recall plain sense being one of them. So I'm wondering, when he creates this new term, plain sense, I guess it's a twofold question. Is he recovering? Is he, as it were, surreptitiously using humanist historical criticism to say we've never understood this in the first place? And secondly, well, maybe that's enough.
So Calvin, so the term plain sense, or sometimes he will say lucid brevity. The interpretation should be lucid brevity, and what we're looking at is the plain sense. And I'm just going to spout forward, and I'll even footnote it, David Steinmetz. Steinmetz is really clear, and I think absolutely correct, that what Calvin and some like him are doing is taking the 4 senses and they're folding them down into the literal sense. They are recognizing that at some places the literal sense in its true sense is not literal. Any metaphor is not meant literally. Jesus says, I am a door. We don't revere doors. So Calvin is doing that. Now, does his humanistic training come through in his biblical exegetical work? Absolutely. However, not entirely. This is this point where he's going to say, yes, but the plain sense of the Scripture might lead us to believe this, but a better reading and then he'll say, and I've a different book on this. He'll say the fuller sense, and the fuller sense of Scripture is always orthodox.
Sensus plenior.
Yeah, but he deals from the top of the deck until he needs to deal from the bottom, and that's I think everyone does. So I'm not.
Follow up. As long as you had the fourfold reading of Scripture established in medieval theological institutions, you always had support for saying the literal sense of the text is not the real sense. That the literal sense of the text is misleading, and that's why we need 3 other senses to back us up. So Erasmus sort of does away with that scheme, and everybody follows him in doing away with that. But it does sound to me like this census, what does he call it? Plenior. It does sound to me like the census plenior is a way of obscuring the traditional license for
he wants
marginalizing what appears to be the census.
So remember that Aquinas says you can only base an argument on the literal sense.
Oh.
You can't make a theological argument on the anagogical sense because that's always up in the air. So he's trying to get to that, and Calvin. Let's be fair to him. He lives in a time of great strife. So coming up with answers is a big key.
Yeah, I'm fascinating talk, and I have to get the book. This is fun. I'm wondering if you would comment on whether you see a counterpart with Calvin's theory of or approach to tradition on the other, and his approach to nature, or his approach to creation, or even natural law. You people have noted similar unwillingness in Calvin to recognize that he's using arguments that look suspiciously like natural law.
So.
Is that similar? Is it different or the same?
So I'm more convinced. A scholar from the early 20th century, Brunner. So Brunner writes a short book, Calvin's sense of the nature. And Bart writes back, 9. No. I think Bart was wrong. Well, I'm far more willing to say that than most Presbyterians. I think Bart was quite simply wrong. And Susan Schreiner has written a beautiful book. It's her doctoral dissertation, which is now, well, she's retired. So, and I keep thinking it just came out, called "The Theater of His Glory," Calvin and natural theology, and she makes the argument. This is throughout his work. Calvin. I took with Dan Migliore down at Princeton, and he would say he would do these dialogues in the voice of Bart, and and Bart was always saying, "Remember, I'm not a Bartian." Well, Calvin's not a Calvinist.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was interested by referring to constitutional originalism, and in commenting on Calvin, and particularly when you refer to the argument with Luther, Joachim, and Westphal, you mentioned that he didn't engage on the same ground, but on Scripture, but he engaged on Augustine. So I was wondering whether the impasse that we face with constitutional originalists is suggesting, if you look at Calvin, as an inspiration, that maybe we cannot engage them on the same ground, but we need to try to move forward relying on other elements that come from, in this case, the tradition. Because otherwise, that we face an impasse. They will never let go of constitutional originalism. We need to find a way out, to another alternative way to bypass that resistance.
Well, I totally agree with that. My argument is that because of the divided heritage that we have received, there are people who believe I don't use any traditions at all. I simply read. I come to the text without presupposition. Was it D.G. Hart, who just translated I'm going to translate the scripture without presupposition. You go do that. And see, strangely, all of his interpretations, translating is interpreting. It simply is. And funny, all of the places his translations end up support what he has stated in all of his other books. So my argument is that these efforts at saying this is a pure textual process, whether and those aren't the only two. I've got scientist friends who will say, no, there's no preconceived notion. I just walk into the lab and start doing experiments. I'm saying, why are you doing this experiment rather than that? Because of last week. I'm like, oh, so last week has an impact on what you're doing this week. No, that's not what I meant. I'm like, yes, it's exactly what you meant. And this is first, I think it's significant for us to think about epistemology in this manner. And second, to be ready to say, point out when someone makes the originalist claim, no, you're not. And right now, evangelicalism in this country is easily the most powerful, politically powerful religious movement. But I can and do look at three different cases I'm looking at things that named people are writing and looking at, well, is this a consistent approach to the scripture? My favorite is Timothy Keller, who started all those churches down in New York. And he just comes out and says, Scripture, we can only look at Scripture straightforwardly. To do anything else is to give up Christianity entirely. And so he says, so look at 1 Corinthians 11, women aren't allowed to lead. That's why we don't have women pastors. The end. I'm like, okay. Let's keep looking in 1 Corinthians 11. You keep looking at 1 Corinthians 11, what do you find? Paul says it is in the order of nature that women must have long hair. Well done, Susan. And that to do anything else is an abomination. And you look at all the women who are down at Redeemer in their pictures or on staff. They have cute bobs. It's like, whoa, wait. And of course, they're going to say, well, that doesn't, if you're an originalist and you're saying every word in here is from God. Now, I recognize people will say, okay, you're not, that's an unimportant one. That's what the tradition calls adiaphora, things indifferent. So I also look at homosexuality and things like support for Donald Trump and his positions. So it's like I said, it's all in there.
Can I just add a footnote to what you said earlier? Darrell Hart was in my cohort in graduate school. Darrell wrote his dissertation on J. Gresham Machen.
Emily
knows who that is. And Machen broke away from Princeton Theological Seminary
to found Westminster
because it was too liberal. I always have to lay down, to found Reformed Presbyterian.
Dan.
Someone who learned about Greek from Machen's primer. It's
Still, I did.
blast from the past.
I did.
Just the conversation around the last question. I mean, it seems like part of what we're experiencing in the United States now is an epistemic crisis, right? A crisis of separated spheres of knowledge. And so what are you trying to do with the book? Are you trying to suggest that maybe if some elements of the Reformed tradition get this about Calvin and Calvin's epistemic process, that might, in a way, inject something also into the cultural discourse? Is that an aspiration of yours?
I think this is a critical read of history rather than a program going forward. Because until you identify the problem, you can't address it. At the end, I start to do a little bit of, if we were doing if we were addressing this, here are some of the rudiments of what it would look like, but to do that well would be another 250, 60 pages.
Right, because I'm looking at your possibilities there. Catholic and Reformed recognize the significance of epistemic communities. Seems like you're hoping that there's some kind of possibility of
Mark Massa
dialogue happens.
Mark Massa and I have no problem, and he is as Jesuit as
Jesuitical.
Yeah, we have no problem talking about this, and people, Mary Ludy used to say, Warren Holder, do you like wake up with the Westminster Catechism under your pillow? I'm like, no, I was forced to memorize it. You don't have to have it anymore. And so, there are possibilities here. Understanding our history, and any historical theologian is going to make that argument to you, that understanding your history better leads to better outcomes. So I'm definitely there, but there's a lot more work to do.
One last question for.
Oh, you were.
Well, I was just about to say, the challenge for me is that as I look over the landscape of Protestant Christian higher education, where I see the most reflection on the significance of epistemic communities comes from the Calvinists, right? Rather than evangelicals or Baptists or Mennonites or so. People like Alvin Flanagan or Nick Wolterstorff or folks like those. How does that fit with your argument? I mean, they seem to be reflective on the importance of tradition.
Yeah, and I know both Plantinga and I know several of the Plantingas, and I've met Wolterstorff. I think that's a useful observation, but it's not a stop sign. This needs to be a broader conversation. I'm not sure, I've spent my career with Roman Catholics. I'm not sure I would have written on tradition had I not. But I did, and I think there's a really fruitful conversation, especially given Tilley's and Thiel's work that same year. They both came out in 2001. Those are really significant works. I think better than Kathy Tanner's. Kathy gets all mucked up in trying to figure out what culture is.
It never fails. Whenever Ward Conti engages us in a lively conversation, so please join me in thanking Ward.